I just want to say I can't wait to read everyone's book here. All the authors
Yes.
here. Read your book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining us today. So we normally, of course, would have been at the Javits Center. Some of us would have been traveling to New York, but instead we are here. I think it was it Tracy Letts in Lady Bird who quotes Keith Richards and says, "I'm just happy to be anywhere." It's kind of how I feel. But I will introduce you all first, and then I'll let you guys kind of intro your books. I'm gonna do it. I'll do it in order of publication date. How's that? We have Charlotte McConaghy. Your book is Migrations. It's out August 4th in the U.S. Tiffany McDaniel, author of Betty. It is out August 18th. We have Sara Seager, author of Smallest Lights in the Universe, also out August 18th. We have Emily M. Danforth, author of Plain Bad Heroines, out October 13th. And then Robert Jones Jr., you wrote The Prophets, which will be out, we're now into 2021, January 5th. And then Nadia Owusu, January 21st, 2021. So I think if I could have everyone kind of give me your elevator pitch for your book, if you will, like kind of how you're describing the book to family and friends and like what you want readers to know as a first go. And I'll call you guys off. So Robert, I see you first to my left. If you want to talk about The Prophet.
Yes. The Prophets is, for me, my attempt to reinscribe into the historical and cultural narrative the Black queer figure who has been erased. And to do that, I tell this tale of two young Black queer men who are enslaved in the antebellum South, and what their love for each other means to everyone around them, whether that's the enslaver or the other enslaved, and how that transforms the people around them.
Good elevator pitch. Nadia,
Thanks.
how about you?
So Aftershocks is a literary memoir with threads of cultural history. A little bit about my story. I was raised by a Ghanaian father who worked for the United Nations and a Tanzanian stepmother. And my Armenian American mother left when I was 2. And for my father's job, we moved every couple of years from Tanzania to England, to Italy, to Uganda. And in the book, I examine my family histories that include surviving the Armenian genocide and colonialism. My great-grandparents on my mother's side came to America as refugees, and my father was born the year before Ghanaian independence. I also explore disasters, both seismic and private, that I experienced: a civil war in Ethiopia, my father's death when I was 13, and my mother still not coming to claim me, an act of terrorism in Uganda, a shaky relationship with my stepmother, being at the World Trade Center on 9/11 after I'd moved to New York for college, panic attacks and depression. And I began to think of my life as existing on fault lines. I was a global citizen and a person without a clear home, and I've often felt like an outsider and have struggled to find steady ground even in my own sense of self. And so Aftershocks is a way for me to grapple with the multiplicity of identity, the meaning of home, and the ripple effects, both personal and generational, of emotional trauma.
I was reading your book during the time that we had an earthquake in quarantine here in Los Angeles. Someone who's, yes, physically on the fault line, that of course resonated. And Sara, can you tell us a little bit about your memoir as well, please?
In my memoir, I set out to share the exhilarating journey of exploration, what it's like to be on the cutting edge in science. And in my case, in the case of discovering brand new worlds. Every star in the sky is a sun. And each of those suns or stars have planets. We already know of thousands of planets out there. There are billions of stars in our galaxy, and the possibilities out there are huge and wondrous. And have you seen the TV show Big Bang Theory? That's me,
Yeah.
astrophysicist. I work at MIT as a professor, and my job, I like to say, is to search for alien life. Not little green humanoids, not real aliens, but signs of life on these planets orbiting other stars. And my memoir, it's not just about the exploration of outer space, but also about the exploration of inner space. And my memoir kind of tracks a kind of fall off the cliff depression from grief and a kind of bounce back. And I kind of do aim to inspire people and to capture that, when really terrible things happen, great things can come out eventually. And so it's really just an exploration and about the journey.
Can I also ask, what part of the sky are we looking at in your background?
Well, this image here is, I didn't take it or anything, but it's from north somewhere. And yeah, it's an image of the night sky, the northern night sky.
Beautiful.
You can see the northern lights, which
Yeah,
very few people
green,
get to see in real life. But if you ever get to go north, like north of 60 degrees or south, I really hope you have a chance to see them.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And speaking of south, Charlotte down in Australia, if you want to tell us about migrations.
Sure. So Migrations is the story of Franny Stone, who's an ornithologist who sets out to follow the last flock of Arctic terns on what might be their final migration from the Arctic to the Antarctic. And she does this because the world of the story is set in the very near future during the peak of the extinction crisis, when all the animals have either gone extinct or they're very close to. And so it's the story of Franny's life, the things that have led her to take on this incredible journey, the love story with her husband and her search for a family. And ultimately, it's a story about reclaiming hope against impossible odds.
Wonderful. And Tiffany, if you could tell us about Betty.
Yes. Actually, I want to also show my sister, who is a knitter, actually knitted the characters from the book. So I told her I was going to do a shout out. So that's my mother, Betty.
I love it.
It's Freya, and this is Flossie.
Nice.
So I told her I was going to do that. So.
That's how I pictured them when I was reading.
Yeah. Yeah. So the C for Betty actually started nearly 20 years ago when my mother had told me a family secret, and it was the type of secret that most keep buried. And after I discovered that, I began to discover even more about the family. And it's interesting writing a family story because you know the people, but unless you really sit down and talk with them, there are so many things that are kept hidden. And if I had not been writing this book, most of these things would have probably died with that generation. So it goes to show how incredibly important family stories are and how important it is to speak with our elders and listen to the lives they lived. And this novel, I hope, captures that spirit of lineage and family history, and also just trying to capture my mother's story to the best of my ability, and really hoping that it connects to readers in a way that really also makes her proud as well.
And Emily, last but certainly not least, on Plain Bad Heroines.
The dreaded elevator pitch. I've been calling the book Sapphic Gothic Metafiction, but when I say that, my family members blink at me. So I've come up with a little bit of math, and it's Picnic at Hanging Rock plus the Blair Witch Project times lesbians, which is a little bit less blinking, but not still plenty of blinking. It's a great big Gothic novel that I think both celebrates the Gothic tropes and pokes a lot of fun at them. It's half historical, set in 1902, and it's half set present day, where the present day characters are essentially investigating and making a film about the events of 1902. So, lesbians.
Yeah. I love it.
Oh, it's just fun, a fun word to say. Don't get to say it enough, so.
Just drop it in anytime. Feel free to interrupt any of us at any
point. I really
point.
recommend it to drop it in anytime and see how that works for you.
I love it. And a fair number of you are debut authors. And I'm curious if you could kind of talk about like what your path to publishing has been like whether, you know, kind of your experience getting the book out into the world and kind of how you're feeling about it at this point. I think, Robert, I'll start with you again, partly just because you're to my left and also because you've have an interesting kind of take, I would imagine, as you're not new to writing at all, but this is your debut novel specifically. So I'm curious how that's been for you.
Yeah, this novel, the idea for it actually came to me from my first year in the MFA program I was in at Brooklyn College, where Stacey D'Erasmo, published author, asked us to find items that a character in our works would possess. And I, in the most bizarre turn, found a pair of shackles by a garbage can in Brooklyn. And when I lifted these shackles, they were actual like weighty metal shackles. And I said, oh my God, my character is enslaved. And I immediately did a lot of research to determine, is there anyone or any story about a Black queer character during antebellum slavery? And I could not find a single story. And because the great Toni Morrison said, if you cannot find a story you wish to read, you must write it, I said, okay, I have to write it. And it was the hardest thing I ever had to do because I had to imagine it myself. I had very little to go on in terms of what would it have been like to be Black and queer during that awful period in our history. And so that was 2006. And I have been writing and revising this novel while working, first while I was in the MFA program, 3 part-time jobs. And then when I graduated, a full-time job. So I had to commit maybe waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning to write 2 or 3 pages, or writing on the bus or the subway, to finally get this novel into a place where I said, okay, can I show it to someone? And I showed it to an agent, thinking he's gonna hate it, it's gonna be terrible, no one's gonna understand why I'm trying to write this story, everyone's gonna find it offensive. And he didn't. And because he didn't, it gave me the faith to say, okay, maybe I have something that's worthwhile here. And luckily, that's how some of the publishers have responded. And here it is, 13 years later, The Prophets.
What a good story. And Sara, you, I mean, of course, also work full time. So I would imagine you had a similar kind of schedule when it comes to like finding time to write and like bring a book out into the world. What was your path to publishing like?
Well, one thing I learned is that the book agents, they're literally scouring newspapers, articles, and anything to like find the next book. And in around end of 2015, there was an article about me written by someone else in the New York Times Magazine. Like the day that article came out, like I had so many people writing to me about this, wanting it to be a whole book, not just like a short article. And that was really overwhelming. So I literally had this list and I interviewed all of them. I went with the best one. And then the book was a process. I mean, that happened in 2015. It's now 2020. And it might not have been as long as some other books, but it was an incredible process. Like writing a memoir, like reliving your life, especially the painful parts, like births and deaths, like over and over and over again. It's a lot, actually. And then you write the book and it's done, but it's not actually, right? It's half done or less. And then the editor has lots of great suggestions and you have to reorg and rewrite. So it's definitely, as you said, like a process of giving birth. And I'm really excited about my book to come out, but I also feel it's like birthing anything, like a real child or anything, that it's going to go out into the world and you have no idea what its path is going to take. It'll get a life of its own and hopefully it'll be a good one.
Yeah, that's very true. And Nadia, what about for you? You also wrote a memoir. I believe you did an MFA program as well, right? You have a long educational background in your author bio that I'm very impressed by as someone with only a bachelor's degree. But can you talk about your path?
Sure. So I wrote Aftershocks as a way to process trauma and to overcome the ache of isolation that I felt from being distant from my loved ones for much of my life, both geographically and just culturally, linguistically. And so part of me just really wanted to better understand the places that I came from and the places that I tried to belong to. And so I was doing a lot of research about my cultures, Ghanaian and Armenian, and I wanted a deeper understanding of where my parents came from and the context in which they were making the choices that they've made. And I learned a lot about my father's tribe, the Ashanti tribe, and I had experienced some of the customs and observed them, but I didn't always know what they meant. And then similarly on my mother's side, because I didn't grow up with my mother and sort of came back into a relationship with her in my 20s, I felt very disconnected from the Armenian culture as well. And so was trying to learn a lot about that history and particularly my family's story of genocide. And so really it was a project that I started to heal myself. And then as I was turning 30, I realized I've always been a writer. I've always written to sort of process the world and understand myself. But I'd never really given myself a chance to approach it as a career. I have a whole other career as an urban planner. And so that's sort of where I was spending my days, but I felt like I would regret it if I didn't give myself that chance. And so that's why I went into an MFA program. I was working full time, so I did a low residency program. That's where I sort of polished Aftershocks and took it out of sort of the processing space into how do I make art out of my story, which is a very different thing. And so that's what I spent my time, the 2 years in the MFA program doing. And then I started publishing a few of the essays, and through a connection to one of the faculty members who sent one of my essays to her agent, who became my agent, that's sort of where the path to publishing happened. And my agent is wonderful. We spent over a year working together to continue to edit and to dig in and to get the book into shape for submission. And once it went out, it all happened really quickly, which I did not expect. But it was a very exciting time. And this is an exciting time too, as I look towards January, when the book is actually going to come out into the world. It's both exciting and terrifying, but mostly exciting.
Yes. And Charlotte, I feel like you're in kind of an interesting position because you've written, I believe, 8 books for the Australian market, and this is your US debut. So you're kind of like straddling both. It's also just so crazy to me to think like the way that our American mindsets can be so tunnel vision on like things that are created for the States, whereas you know, here you are having written 8 books in Australia, but that's a whole other topic. But I'm curious kind of for you how you've been like your path to coming into the US market.
Yeah. So as you said, I do have a background writing very different books. So I started quite young. I was 14 when I started my first book, and that kind of started me off on this publishing journey of fantasy and sci-fi books for kids. And that's probably another reason why the books are kind of kept so separate from from migrations, because it's a totally different genre and a very different market. But I reached a point where I wanted to challenge myself to write something very different. And it was the hardest thing I've ever done, writing migrations. I think it lived in a much deeper place in me. And so it was, like everyone's saying, it was like a birth to kind of get it out. But it was also wonderful. It was just such a joy. And it went to my agent, and luckily she loved it. And then luckily it found a home at Flatiron in the US, and now it's being called my US debut, which is very exciting. And there's less than a month until it comes out. So yeah, it's definitely the scariest one.
Yes, I can imagine. And Emily and Tiffany, this is not your first book in the States, but I am wondering, it's of course a very different time in the world for, you know, all the reasons that we could list than either of your previous books. And I'm curious kind of whether it's because of the world or just because of yourself and writing your books, what feels different this time around versus your debut? Emily, I'll go to you first since I see
Well, my debut is a YA book, and so there's that, I think, like difference to it. It was a different market, and yeah, it came out in 2012. I'm very slow; it takes me a while. So, and there were a very
long book.
It's a very long book, and there were a lot of. Thank you. If you could follow me around in future and explain that to people, I'm also just very slow. It took me. There were a lot of stops and starts, and I actually thought this would be a YA book, and it wouldn't have. Really, about half the book is set in 1902, and when I started writing it, it really was just a contemporary story of these 3 women that are involved in the making of this film. And over the writing of the book, that really changed until it became the book that it is. So the process of kind of getting it from what I thought it was going to be to the book that it is was long and challenging, and echo the things that I've heard other people say. There's so many things that are different this time. I mean, I wouldn't say the least of which, but COVID is obviously one. I mean, it just feels like all of the conversations are different, and being aware of not wanting necessarily to take up promotional space kind of like in conversation is certainly one of them. Feeling like maybe there are better things for me to be doing than telling people to read my Gothic novel. You know, there's a bunch of things that feel really different right now. And so I know that we're all kind of, adjusting to that, but it feels like, partly because it's a different book, but it's also just such a different time to be putting a book into the world. So I know authors are talking about this all over.
Mm-hmm. What about for you, Tiffany?
Well, The Summer That Melted Everything, it was my first published novel, but it was actually my 5th or 6th novel written. And Betty was the first novel I had wrote, and I wrote it nearly 20 years ago. And as I was querying the agents, they would say, oh, this is very female, and there's not going to be a big enough audience for it, and it's too female, and that makes it too risky. And so, I was told it just wasn't the type of book that would appeal to a wide enough publishing audience. And then we had, the recent feminist movement, and that really sort of turned the tide, and people started to lean into these stories more. But it was a long battle to get anybody to kind of take a chance on Betty. And, I look back at those nearly 2 decades, and I look back at publishing The Summer That Melted Everything, and it was probably meant to be my first published novel, and Betty was always meant to be the following novel. But they do both take place in Breathitt, Ohio, which is where my mother grew up and where I grew up, and so they do feel very similar. And I think as I explored Sal's story in The Summer That Melted Everything, I was in many ways also exploring my mother's story as well. So in many ways, they're connected, and I feel that between the two of them.
Mm-hmm. And I think Tiffany, several of your books, but Tiffany, yours as well, while I have you, Emily mentioned something that is a conversation I've been having a lot with authors, which is like, who should be taking up like the room in the conversation right now. And we're all having this kind of confusion over, like, first it was during COVID, like, is it silly to be talking about a book? And then like a lot of people, it's like, is it silly to be talking about a book that doesn't deal with like any really serious issues of the day, etc. But your book, I would say, Robert's, Nadia's, like yours all really touch on racism very specifically, right? Like in each of your own different unique ways. But, and like Tiffany, while I have you, does that, because you're also your novel is coming out within the month. Do you think that's going to like either change the conversation around the novel, or has that kind of changed the way that you think it will like find its place in the world? And is that something you'd even want to happen? I know a lot of authors who've like, people have rediscovered their past books are like kind of sad that this is what's making audiences like go for stories that like deal with, race relations or experiences of other races. So I'm curious kind of what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I should say that I am very fair-skinned, and so my experiences that my mother had and the experiences that my grandfather had in that side of the family, I do not have first-hand experience with. I haven't dealt with racism like my mother and my grandfather had. They came of age with brown skin and white communities. And so, I listened to the stories of my grandfather being beaten up for the color of his skin and being excluded from certain jobs and things that he was doing in the community. And so I'm coming at it from a different perspective, an outsider perspective. And my hope with the novel is just that I am telling, their story, their version of events, and sort of uplifting that story, but also not sort of inserting myself in that narrative, but just saying this is the story of my mother and grandfather.
Robert, what about for you? Kind of how does, obviously your book, it'll be 2021, and it's like so hard to predict kind of where hopefully all the conversations we've been having in the next month will still be like very, very pressing. And like, I shudder at the use of something like timeliness to describe topics that are in your novel, and Nadia too, a lot of the experiences that you had, but I guess urgency maybe feels more prescient. But either way, I'm kind of curious what that feels like for you to have this conversation shifting as your novel is on the offing.
What was amazingly interesting to me was that it didn't feel like I was writing about the 1830s. It felt like I was writing about today. And all of the research I did, all of the writing I was doing, I kept feeling these echoes, like, this could be today. Like, the Black body is still under assault. The Black body is still being policed. Violence seems to be the way of the world. And so I always imagined that whenever this book would debut, it would be relevant and timely, because anti-Blackness is so perennial. It never seems to go away. It has this uncanny ability to sort of shapeshift for the tastes of the time that it's in, so that it looks as though it's harmless, but it actually is the same toxic paradigm over and over and over again with new clothes. So given what we're about to face in November, and given whatever that outcome might be, I imagine that the topics that all of us are talking about will still be relevant, because racism isn't decided in an election. Certainly, maybe the tone of the conversation will be a little bit different if one outcome is, if there's one outcome and not another. But the fact of the racism is the American fact, and I don't think we as a nation have really done the work to pat ourselves on the back about, oh well, we made a decision that will end racism. Racism, unfortunately, and a lot of other bigotries, whether it be anti-LGBTQIA+, whether it be misogyny, whether it be ableism, they're here with us to stay until we're ready to confront them. And I'm hoping with the prophets, we can have a bit of that confrontation.
It really did. It's so interesting reading your novel, Robert, and Nadia, yours as well. It's like this, I mean, Robert's was describing what was happening to Black bodies at the beginning of our country, and then Nadia, here yours is 200 years later, and it's like the same, I mean, the same hundreds of years later, but it's the internet. But yeah, I'm wondering. So yeah, Nadia, if you could kind of talk about what that has been like for you, and kind of how you kind of predict your novel being a part of the conversation, or even just kind of what your experience within engaging in that conversation with your novel, or with your memoir, sorry.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, building off of what Robert just said, I think to me, it's impossible to write about America without writing about racism. It's in the groundwater. We're living in a country that was built on the genocide of one people and the enslavement of another people. And that history is alive every day. And, as a Black woman, maybe I notice it more than a lot of white people in my everyday life, but that doesn't mean that it's not still there, guiding all of the choices that we have, guiding the opportunities that we have, guiding our relationships with each other. And if we're writing about relationships, which most writers are doing, then I don't really know how to do that in this country without addressing racism. And then, we also don't live in a world that is disconnected from the rest of the world as well. It's all very much connected. And although I didn't grow up in the United States, I am American, but I grew up around the world. And the reality is, often I get the question, how are you writing about racism? Does racism exist in Africa, or does racism exist in Europe? And the answer to that, of course, is yes, it absolutely does exist. Those systems are so interconnected. First of all, America is present no matter where you are in the world. So that's also part of the story that we're in right now. And I would say as well, you can't write about Europe without writing about colonialism. You can't think about European history without writing about slavery either. And even thinking about some of the histories of the quote unquote white side of my family, although Armenians petitioned a court to become white when they arrived in America, understanding the specious nature of race in this country. But even thinking about the Armenian genocide, that's another form of oppression, like based on difference, that is very much connected to the kinds of racism that we see now. And so to me, yes, we're having a different kind of conversation today than maybe we were a year ago, and then we were 10 years ago. And there's still so much work that needs to be done in order to address the oppressive systems which undergird our entire existence in this country. And so hopefully, as more people are writing about their experience or imagining worlds in which the lives of people of color are centered, we can begin to have different kinds of conversations.
Absolutely. And Nadia, both you and Sarah's memoirs both really struck me as, one, they're of course very personal, it's the nature of memoir, but generous in how open you were both willing to be. And I think like none of us are owed any parts of either of your stories, but it felt so, like I felt so honored to be reading that part. And I'm curious, Nadia, I'll have you go first, just since we were just answering, but kind of what went into the decision of like deciding how open or how honest or kind of like how much of yourself to share in this medium?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, the themes and the story that I wanted to tell kind of guided those questions. And I didn't think as I was writing so much about what I wanted to leave in and out. And that sort of came with the editing process as I began to think about, okay, well, what is the story that I want to tell, and what do I want people to take away from this story? And I think for me, particularly as I'm writing about trauma and I'm writing about mental illness as a Black woman, which are, topics that we often don't hear about, it was really important for me to be honest about as much of my experience as possible, in the hopes that we can expand understanding, empathy, and conversation around these important issues. And so that's really what was driving me. And then, of course, there are things that I decided not to say, either because I didn't want to be hurtful to other people. I was also really very much focused on self-interrogation more than anything. And so those were sort of things that I held as I was writing into this memoir.
And Sara, I think you have an interesting kind of story too, because you are a very public figure within your field, right? Like you're like the preeminent astrophysicist, I believe is the term, but it's still a whole different thing to share this other side of yourself and the story of your late husband. And so kind of what went into, how did you decide like what to make public and what to share?
Definitely a tough one. But ultimately, if you want the readers to go with you on your journey, you really have to put it all out there. It's so hard to say goodbye to your best friend at the time, like the best friend I ever had. How much detail do you want to reveal that's kind of not unfair to the person who died? Like, it's really a tough one. Very, very tough. And I did have a lot of help from my team. And I want to just echo what Nadia said in a more direct way. You probably don't want to ask the question, but you should be wondering what is left out. Because when people write a kind of story that's so like, wow, eye-opening, there's a lot of stuff that's not in there. And to Nadia's point, there's a lot of stuff that has to be left out because you can't accuse people of things, even if it's in your memory. So a lot of bad stuff. But on a lighter note, at the end of my book, it's my favorite part. When I go to a conference, it's actually an amateur astronomy conference. But as soon as I got to that conference, I went to reception. And across the room, I saw a tall, dark, handsome man. And honestly, it was just like the movies, only it was an astronomy conference. And in the end, we ended up getting married, and we're very happy together. And he adopted my two boys, who are now teenagers. But even there, like, is it fair to him to talk about how we fell in love? And when you're older, you have a lot of baggage. You can't help it. And someone in that relationship has to give up a lot. Like, he left everything he knew. He lived in the same place, went to the same cottage for 50 years. And he literally left his country and came here. Which was all fine until the coronavirus, because now it's hard to go back to Canada. It's hard to go back, say, quarantine. But yeah, so it's really hard to think of what to put in, what to put out. A lot got left out, but enough is there so people can be really with you on the journey.
That makes sense. Charlotte, I'm curious for you, what kind of was the interest or like the impetus to discuss kind of like the climate change and environmentalism aspect in your book? Like, of course, it takes place when essentially it's something that it feels like dystopian adjacent, right? Like all of almost all of the animals have gone extinct, but it also feels, nothing else about your book feels dystopian. It all feels like it could be tomorrow. So I'm kind of curious what it is about that's kind of your passion project, or kind of how you chose to build the story around that.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, actually, something that Nadia just said really rang true, because it's something that I often say, and I didn't ever set out to write a climate change book, but I think if you're trying to write about the natural world, then you can't ignore it. You can't not write about climate change. And so it happened quite naturally. The reason I set the book in this such a near future was that I didn't want it to be a dystopian look at how the deaths of animals affect our food production or anything scientific like that. I wanted it to be an existential look at how the loss of animals will affect us on an emotional level. The loneliness of being here alone. I didn't want the book to feel like it was far in the future. I wanted it to feel like now, because I think that's more confronting. And the truth is that we're really not that far from a world without animals. In the last 50 years alone, we have killed over 60% of our wild animals. We see on the news all the time how another species is being critically endangered or extinct. We nearly lost our koalas in the bushfires, along with 1 billion other animals. I kind of feel like I'll never be able to write anything again that doesn't consider, at least in some way, our impact on the environment and the creatures we share the planet with. But having said all of that, I think it's really important also to note that I wanted this to be a book about hope. We all feel some low-level anxiety about the state of the planet, and it's really, really hard to be optimistic in the face of it. It's easy to be apathetic and to be hopeless. So it was very important to me that this book, despite embracing the bleak future, that it was also very hopeful. It's about picking up the fight and denying the fear that we're powerless.
I just had the temptation to ask you, Sara, to shed some light on whether we have a chance on another planet. And then I realized, probably as your job, everybody asks you to talk about that every time you're anywhere. The way that, like, a doctor, people are like, "What's wrong with my elbow?"
Yeah, well,
I won't.
I do want to answer it though, because it is such a great question. But the reality is, these other worlds are so far away. They are literally trillions of miles away. We don't have anywhere to get there in our lifetime. And Mars is where we want to see boots on Mars, but even that, the environment's really inhospitable. So we have to protect this planet.
Very true, very true words. Emily, I think one of the things that really struck me about your novel was, like, me picturing all of the research and all of the work and thought that went into it to take this kind of, like, especially because my reader copy had the newsletter pullout with the article about Mary's book from back in the day. But I wondered if you can kind of talk about, one, like, building this really, really in-depth fictional world around, like, this nugget of truth, and then also, like, kind of how much because you imbued it with this, like, wonderful queerness, but how much of that was there at the beginning, and kind of, or was it all just kind of you being like, this is what the story needs? Or, like, because I know I've also followed you on Instagram, and I know you found a lot of really cool like historical, like, postcards and things like that, that kind of hint at the world that you built. And I'm wondering if that came afterwards or what.
Yeah, my wife rolls her eyes every time the mail comes, because I can't stop, like, getting these things off eBay, and she's like, "Do we really need another sapphic stereo view card of two women, like, lounging together?" And I'm like, "I do need this, actually," and I had to bid to get it. So yeah, no, some of the research was just fun. It's like constantly being told as a queer person, there are no artifacts, there is no record like that. It's bull. Of course, you said we could say shit on the internet. Of course there is, and you can. So I'm taking you at your word, and you can find it, and you can bid against eBay user, Zoom 47 to get it if you want to. And Dorothy Allison said something a number of years ago in her tremendous book of essays, Skin, about, I'm tired of having. I'm going to paraphrase here, which you should not do with Dorothy Allison, but something to the effect of, I'm tired of having arguments when people tell me a book is or isn't queer, is or isn't lesbian. You know, if I read it as it is, right? And I feel that way when I find a picture of two women, a black and white picture, you know, on a beach holding hands. I don't know anything about this photo or where it came, but I read this as, right, some sort of a romantic friendship or some sort of love between these women, and that's how I'm choosing to take that. So there was, you know, that's a kind of research, but it wasn't the other pieces of research for the book, which were things like reading Lillian Faderman and her tremendous and indispensable book Surpassing the Love of Men, which is sort of like 300 years about romantic friendships and love between women. And certainly the book at the heart of my novel is the story of Mary McLean, her memoir, which she wanted published as I Await the Devil's Coming. And you know, before I read the book for the first time, what I'd heard about that memoir, this tremendous memoir by a 19-year-old published in 1902, is that she's, you know, was sort of openly bisexual. She's 19 and she was from Montana. And I, being from Montana, born and raised, was just astounded that I'd never heard of her. But it was largely this narrative about what a sensation she was, right? And sort of how she grabbed all the headlines and she got cocktails named after her. And I had no idea just how vibrant her writing would be and how much I would love the prose itself. She's funny. She's beseeching the devil to come and rescue her all the time. She is explicitly sexual. 1902 in her desires for her female teacher. I mean, it feels so contemporary. And I just kind of kept being like, is this a blog? Am I reading a blog? Or is this like a, you know, this a memoir that was published in 1902? It was astounding to me. And it's so queer. And so having that book and knowing that it generated in teen girls across the country this cultish sort of fan base, I mean, there was just no way that I couldn't write about that. So when you talk about sort of like imbuing the novel with queerness, it was there. I mean, I didn't have to, it was all there. It's queer in the sense of sort of, right, the gothic queer, and it's there in the more contemporary sense of the queer. It was always there. But the research certainly was sometimes really fun to draw it out.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Robert, I mean, your novel, I would imagine, because you said, you know, you wrote the book that you wanted to read, but in the process of doing that, did you do any research or find any kind of like hints of a similar kind of experience having that happened? Like, I read your book, and even though I've never read anything like it, it also feels so true. And so, like, of course, this is what someone's experience had to have been like. There had to have been like queer people during that time. I mean, that relationship feels so true, but again, you're the first time I've read it. So I'm wondering if you kind of discovered any history or reading on that.
I scoured every slave narrative. I looked for anything that I can find. I even read a lot of the sociological and anthropological works out there to find out where is the Black queer person in antiquity. Mm-hmm. And what I found was, interestingly enough, hints of rape. It was always in the context of sexual assault, that it was the master who raped the slave or something to that effect. Or it was presented as these two men are desiring each other because there are no women around. They're just, you know, this is just their instincts because there were no women to satisfy their urges. But my question was, what about love? And I could not find examples of love. Even in the anthropological research I found of pre-colonial African societies that did not look or did not frown upon queer relationships. It was usually in the form of ritual. So the men would go hunting and they would be gone for weeks and they would frolic together and then come back to their wives. So there was nothing I could find about love. And that's why I knew I had to write this book, because there had to be love, but it has been erased. And I would say probably consciously erased, because there is in the world, not just in America, this desire to make the entire world cisgender and heterosexual, that the lesbian doesn't exist, that the gay man doesn't exist, that the transgender person does not exist, and that we're aberrations, and that we're the result of some trauma that happened to us that moved us out of the path of righteousness. And no, I insist that I am here because I was meant to be here, and that we have a history. And if I have to imagine it, I'm going to put it back on record.
I think that it really speaks to why reading the book and reading that story feels so revelatory and then I felt terrible that I was like, why does this feel like it's opening my eyes to something that I should have known and considered had been a story all along? But I guess therein lies the quandary. I'm wondering too, like, as all of your books are so wonderfully like personal and passionate, and as you're about to release them out into the world and let them live like a life of their own, and you also each like tackle, you know, race, environmentalism, feminism, everything. I'm curious kind of if you have any hopes or like a wish list or anything that you want readers to take away from the book, or like that you would love to see be the conversation, or kind of just anything that you are hoping will be, and it doesn't have to be a message, but just anything that you hope readers will take away from the book. And I'll start with Nadia because you're right here.
Sure. So a couple of things that come to mind and are sort of inspired by this conversation that we're having about history and the rewriting of history. So the African history that I learned in school, even when I was physically located in Africa, because I went to international schools, was so, I want to say often, but probably the reality is always written from a Western perspective. And so it was really important to me to write a story that served me and honored my family and where my family came from. And similarly, the Armenian side of my family, the Armenian genocide is still denied by many countries. And so it was really important for me to just claim that history and center it in the experience of my ancestors and my family. And, you know, a lot of the stories that were given about pre-colonial Africa or about places that are not the West are stories that to me were not familiar, or like I didn't feel like I could live inside of them, coming from the family that I came from. And so I wanted to write a story that was that I could live in, and that could help me understand the experiences of my family. And then I've been thinking a lot lately, you know, as we're all sort of isolated from loved ones and from family. And again, I was really writing this story to kind of heal the ache of my own isolation. And so although it's a very particular story, I think that there's a lot in it that is really relevant to this moment that we're in now of collective grief and trauma and isolation. And the biggest thing for me in terms of thinking this book as a healing book was that I'm constantly reminded that although I started writing this book from a place of grief and sadness and reckoning, I ended up writing toward love and connection, and really love as an active thing, and thinking of, you know, despite the distance, despite the linguistic challenges, you know, that I have always encountered growing up all over the world and with families that in cultures that I didn't that I wasn't fully connected to in a unquestionable way. But there was a lot of active love. It became a choice. You know, if you don't speak the language, you're going to find a way to love each other anyway. You're going to find a way to love each other across oceans. And so I also hope that that's something that that connects to people as they're reading the book.
Sara, what are you hoping that people take away from your memoir?
First, I just want to say, oddly enough, although Nadia's book is so incredibly different from mine, mine also is about a journey of grief and isolation, not fitting in, and it also ends with connection and love. So I want to say that life is short. It sounds incredibly trite, but the message from my book is life is short. You know, anyone that you love or you can be, bad things can happen. And so we really need to seize the moment and really, really take risks, you know, in your job, in romance, and anything. And just to be open to the possibilities of the universe and for great things to happen. And that's my story, and that's the takeaway message.
I think it's a tie, a pretty close tie between Sara, your book, and Tiffany, your book, on how much I ugly cried during like the several hundred pages. So Tiffany, I'll ask you next. Besides my tears of both joy and sadness, but what are you hoping that people take away from your book?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of intense moments in the book, and a lot of it pulled from my grandmother's experiences. And when I look at the book, I look at a book of light with moments of darkness in it, as opposed to looking at it as a book of darkness with slivers of light. And I think that's what life is, where we're looking at it. Moments of those times that we're really trying to carve our own path forward. And when I look back at the journey of this book, and I hope that more stories like Betty will begin to populate our shelves, and that we'll learn that female stories are not too female, that there isn't anything risky about them, that they really add to literature and will only increase our understanding of one another. And I hope that it becomes a book that women want to share with one another, that mothers want to share with their daughters, and sisters with their sisters, and girlfriends with their girlfriends. And it's not to say that it will distance or alienate male readers, but it's just to say that female stories are human stories, regardless of gender. And it's just to say that it speaks that female narrative in a way that I hope we can all learn something about what it means to be a girl on the cusp of womanhood.
Wonderful. And also, as I'm now thinking about it too, Tiffany, Sara, and Nadia, all three of your books had father figures in the story that I was so struck by. All very, for each varying reasons, but just written so beautifully, as we're not to pivot from a female perspective to a male perspective, but that did really stick out in my mind about all three of you. And Charlotte, your book did not have a great father figure, but aside from that, you had a very strong protagonist. But what are you kind of hoping that people take away from Migrations?
So I hope that they understand from reading it how far along this environmental crisis we really are, but that also we have a responsibility now to take up this fight. There's so many ways that we can have a huge impact, and they're all really small, easy decisions to make. And they're not going to make a huge sacrifice in our lives. So I hope that people take away from this book just a consideration for how we might do things differently, considering our impact, and really taking up the fight, because yeah, we haven't lost it yet, and we are responsible for taking it up.
Wonderful. And Emily, what about you?
I hope that for fans of the Gothic, this gives them the fully sapphic Gothic experience they're looking for, both past and present, and really centers. I mean, the Gothic has horror, but certainly it has romance, and really centers that sapphic romance for them in pleasurable ways. But also, I think the cherry on the sundae for me is if it introduces even one reader to Mary MacLane and they seek out her work, because it's certainly worthy of a look. And I know she's been reclaimed by feminist and queer academics and writers, certainly, but she's still, I think, criminally underknown. So I think if it makes people find her memoir, that will be thrilling to me.
I'll put myself on the line and say your book introduced her to me.
Awesome.
I was not very familiar with her. So, and we're almost out of time, but I also wanted to ask everyone, if anyone has like any other authors or artists or creators, or just like who you've been really inspired by lately that you wanted to shout out as we're here, and we're all, we all look towards other people's works to help us do our own creative work. So I'm curious if anyone, and you can volunteer at your leisure if anyone has that. Robert, yeah.
I've been reading These Ghosts Are Family by Maisie Card. It is a phenomenal, the way she constructed that book and how it travels through time and from the life to afterlife is just absolutely brilliant. And she's using Jamaican patois and standard English, and she's just mixing all of these things, and somehow it works, and it's accessible, and it's beautiful. And I'm just astounded by the craft of that book. And I actually know Maisie. She and I were classmates in the MFA program, but we never really got to take any courses together. But it is just a phenomenal work, and it has such a power, and it has such interesting and quirky characters, and she does these really interesting things with dialogue. I'm just a huge fan.
So I've been reading a lot of Black women lately, and there are so many brilliant Black women writing right now. So just to add to Robert's recommendation, I'm currently reading Britt Bennett's The Vanishing Half, which is brilliant. It's a beautiful book. And also simultaneously reading Wayatu Moore's memoir, The Dragons, the Giants, and the Women, which is also a really wonderful book. And recently finished also a novel and a nonfiction book, Megan Giddings' Lakewood and Basie Ickby's essay collection, I'm Telling the Truth But I'm Lying. All really wonderful reads.
Yeah.
To stay with Gothic for a minute, there's so many people working in the Gothic space. So Elizabeth Thomas has this great book. It's her debut, Catherine House, which is a boarding school, super atmospheric, creepy book. And then there's a book that just came out last week, Mexican Gothic, which is Sylvia Moreno Garcia, that I've been tearing through and loving. And then if you're looking for a YA book because you read them yourself, or you want a great one for a teen reader, there's a book called You Should See Me in a Crown by Leah Johnson. And it just was really like romantic and fun and queer, and it's fantastic. It's her debut, so You Should See Me in a Crown. I whipped through it through the weekend and loved it.
I just want to say I can't wait to read everyone's book here. All the authors here read your book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great meeting all
Very
of you.
much so.
But I'm sure this won't be the last time that we're speaking, and the last that we'll be hearing of all of your books. So thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to talk about your buzzy 2020 and 2021 novels.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.